Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this very, very special presentation. My name is Daniel Reed. I'm the education coordinator of the Holocaust Memorial in Miami Beach. And on behalf of the Holocaust Memorial and our board of directors and the Department of Education, I do want to thank you for coming to this very, very special presentation that we have. We have with us this morning a very special guest. His name is Paul Salmons. He's the director of the Museum Exhibition and Educational Development Company, Paul Salmons Associates. He's the curator of the international award-winning exhibition, Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Far Away. He's also been a consultant to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and the chief curator of the exhibition Seeing Auschwitz for UNESCO and the United Nations, which is currently on exhibition in San Sebastian, Spain. He's an excellent Holocaust educator who's coming to us this morning to bring us a very, very special session entitled Ordinary Things. For those of you who've been to England, one of my favorite places to go in London was the Imperial War Museum. And Paul was also instrumental in helping create the National Holocaust Exhibition at this amazing museum. And he's played a leading role in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is an intergovernmental body involving more than 30 countries. So without further ado, okay, you're not here to hear me. You're here to be educated and learn from Paul Salmons. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Danny. It's a delight to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me to join today. And thank you everyone for giving up your time to spend with us over the next 90 minutes or so. I'm going to share my screen so we can dive right in a moment. I hope you can see this PowerPoint. Okay, let's get that started. And as Danny says, we're going to speak about this session, Ordinary Things. So just a little bit of background for you on this. I used to work, as Danny said, at the Imperial War Museum in London, and this small shoe is part of the collection of that museum. And I was interested in helping young people who arrived at the museum to have a sense of what it is they were about to encounter, right? When you have school groups visiting places during their school careers, over here in the UK, they might visit a castle, or they might go to Europe on a skiing trip, or it could be any one of a number of different things. But this time they're coming to a museum to learn about the Holocaust. And obviously there's a certain buzz, a kind of excitement about being out of school. Maybe they've even forgotten why they're coming. We had to find a way to give them a space before they entered this difficult, emotionally challenging exhibition to understand what it was they were going to see and why they were here, and give them some ways of thinking about this difficult past. So I'm offering it to you today as a model, as a way of perhaps introducing the history of the Holocaust to young people who haven't studied it yet. So this was for a museum, but I know many educators, many teachers who've used the same approach that I'm going to show you now in the classroom, using the same object. And that's basically the way I'd like to spend our time together today. As we do so, I'd really like to open it up and hear from as many of you as possible. I'll make this a kind of a conversation. It's a little bit artificial because we're speaking to screens, but I hope we can warm up quite quickly and find a way, and I'm very grateful to Ari, who's going to help us on the technical side here. We'll find a way to have a kind of conversation about these issues. In terms of that conversation, I'm going to be asking a lot of questions, but they're aimed at young people of around 14 or 15 years old. So I know that you will know the history of this very well, and the kinds of questions I'm asking, therefore, are not about testing your knowledge. It's not that. Don't feel condescended to. What I want to do instead is to model for you the kinds of questioning techniques and the approaches that you might want to use with a group of 15-year-olds yourself who are new to this subject. And I want to take you on the kind of narrative arc of this lesson approach, this classroom-based approach, through a kind of modeling. So you're going to be, if I could invite you please to answer from the perspective of a 14 or 15-year-old who's new to this subject, who hasn't studied it in any detail yet. But what do you think typically young people might say and respond? Now, with that in mind, of course, I'm going to assume that you are a group of very engaged, well-motivated and well-behaved 14 and 15-year-olds who are keen to get involved and keen to learn, because there will be a direct relationship between how quickly we have each part of this conversation and when you get your next cup of coffee, if you haven't brought one with you already. Okay, I think this is probably enough background intro. Why objects? Why artifacts? Museums, a lot of the work I do is within museum exhibitions. When we visit a museum, we often expect to see the things that were made at the time, the things that people owned, that they used, that they wore, that they gave as presents, that they threw away. These are the remnants of the past, the things that remain with us in the present today, the physical objects that were once back then and owned by the people that we are interested in. So what I want young people to understand is, well, why are these valuable to us? Particularly as something like this is a very ordinary thing, right? It's not a Ming Dynasty vase or a Rembrandt painting. It seems like a very ordinary thing because our history, the one we study, is a history of destruction, and the things which we're left with might seem in some ways rather banal at first glance. I want young people to slow down and to look closely at these objects and to read them for information and to read them for meaning. And that's really what this approach is going to be about. It's helping them, our 14 and 15-year-olds, to interrogate an artifact and to interpret it. So it might well be that the young people you work with already are very used to doing this with, say, written documents, reading between the lines, thinking about the authorship, thinking about purpose. The same with photographs or other evidence from the time. Objects, artifacts have a different kind of quality and they need a different kind of approach to them. So that's really what this is based on, what this is about. And I'm going to begin with another image of the same object, of this shoe, but for our students, it would be the first thing that they see. On this slide, it tells us a forensic study of Holocaust artifacts. For me and for this lesson, it's important that our students don't yet know what it is we're studying, because I want them to answer these first questions based only on the object, not on their historical knowledge. So when I ask you the next question as well, I don't want you to be thinking about what you know about the Holocaust. Put that to one side. Enter this as if you're 14, 15-year-old, and this is all you've been given, this image and this question. So I'd like you just to give yourself a moment to think about, okay, what is it? And what can we say about the owner of this object? And you have some context in terms of the size of the object from this first slide, but let's have a think about what can we say about this object and its owner. I'm going to be quiet for a few seconds. It can be hard for me sometimes. Give you a moment to think. And when you're ready, if you'd just like to unmute yourself and share your first thoughts, what do you think a typical 15-year-old might say about this object?
It's a shoe, and the owner was a child who was very active, like a lot of children are. Okay,
very good. So there's actually a lot there which we can unpack, right? It's a shoe, it's a child shoe, and the child is active. Anyone else, before I want to unpack some of that in a moment, anyone have anything to add to that or to confirm with that, to corroborate? What else would we say about this shoe?
I didn't think active, I thought poor.
Okay, interesting. Maybe one more person, if you have someone else has something to say about this, and then we'll move on. Okay, well, this is enough.
I'm sorry, I thought wealthy because those are really nice soles on the shoes
Okay.
and nice stitching.
Okay, so the first thing I'd like to think about together here is something about the historical method. We sometimes treat, so I'm going to, as we go through this session, some of the time I'm going to be speaking to you as if you're the 14, 15-year-old student, right? And we're going to model that. Sometimes we'll step out of it and think about our approach and the methodology and our aims that the students aren't necessarily aware of, but why we're doing what we're doing. And in this particular case, I'm interested in young people knowing something about the process of historical inquiry. So there are some ways that people look at history teaching. Sometimes people will think of this as a body of knowledge. Here's the facts. My job is to give young people the knowledge of the past. They will learn it. I might test them on it, and they will understand the meaning that I want to give them. Yeah, that's a very, in terms of pedagogy, a very behaviorist approach to teaching and learning about the past. It's a perfectly valid approach, has a long tradition. It's just not the tradition that I'm immersed in, and it's not the one that I like, right? So I want to take a different kind of approach, which is a disciplinary approach to history. I'm not only interested in young people knowing what happened, I want them to know how we know about the past. And that's through history. The Greek origin of that is to inquire. Yeah, so it's historia. This inquiry process, we need evidence. We have no fixed knowledge of the past, no fixed body. We have evidence, remnants from the past, and we make inferences from them, deductions from them, and we create narratives out of them. So what we're talking about when we speak about the past are truth claims. Yeah, we make different kinds of truth claims about the past, and they will have, I would say, different kinds of status. So in terms of what we've just been speaking about, those colleagues, thank you for sharing, those three different perspectives all agreed on a basic truth that this is a shoe. We could have a philosophical discussion about, is this a shoe or not, right? Or was it an image of a shoe? We're not interested in that here. We're not doing a philosophy class. This is a history inquiry. So we agree it's a shoe. We have the evidence for that. And then we started to make some inferences and some deductions. One of those was that it's a child's shoe. So why are you saying a child? And what age, could someone else, maybe someone who hasn't spoken yet, how old do we think that child might be if it is a child?
I would think about 5.
Anyone else?
I would think a baby.
Another thought? Someone else?
2 or
Give me
3.
an age. Sorry?
Between
2.
2 and 3.
2 or 3. Now, what about gender? Is this, are you looking at a little boy or a little girl's shoe, do you think?
The little boy's shoe,
Little boy's shoe.
and he's probably 6 years old, or was.
Huh. Does anyone think this might be a little girl's shoe? Or that it is a little girl's shoe? Not that it might be that you feel actually this is, you see a little girl wearing this?
I think it could be either a boy or a girl shoe.
It could be either. And honestly, I don't know, right? And this is one of the things we have to be honest with our students about as well. Yeah, when there are things we know and there are things we don't know. This is a very, so I like the language which we're using as well. You said, I think it might be a little boy or a little girl's, right? So there are certain things we know about the past that we're sure of and certain about. And we say, this is a shoe, right? And we're pretty sure, we're pretty confident that this is a child's shoe because of its size. But we're not sure. We know some of you said 6 or 2 or 3 or a baby. That's where we're not sure. It's where our interpretation, our inference, our deduction comes in. And the same with gender, right? You might think it's a little boy, you might think it's a little girl. If you think it's a boy's shoe, and then I give you on the next slide a photograph of a young girl, 4 years old, wearing this shoe, you'd be quite happy to change your mind, right? You're not ideologically committed to the age or gender of this object. You know, you would be, because you're reasonable people. That's important as well when we're talking about the historical method and the historical inquiry. And it might feel right now that he's taking a long time to talk about what we know and what we don't know, and is it a boy, is it a girl? It matters though. I think it really matters. Why does it matter about truth claims when we're speaking about this history, this past, do you think? Why does it matter about the status of those truth claims and how we investigate the past? Does it matter? Most of the time that we've been thinking together, that's what I've been talking about. So it clearly matters to me. How do we know what we know, and what is the status of truth claims? It's not always something we speak about with students. I think we should. Why is it important? Okay, I'll tell you why I think it's important, right? I think this matters because just speaking about the past doesn't make you a historian. There are people that speak about this past, people like in my country, David Irving, a well-known, infamous Holocaust denier. He speaks about the past, but he lies about the past. He mistranslates documents or omits key aspects of it or decontextualizes things, or he'll leave out evidence that doesn't suit his thesis. There's nothing historical about that, right? It's dealing with the past, but history is a discipline which has a way of working, a methodology, an approach, an agreed framework of discourse. And that's why we have peer-reviewed, as other academic subjects do, peer-reviewed papers, and why we footnote our sources, and why we use archives, and why our colleagues and our peers and others can go to those sources and double-check what we're saying. There's a difference then, but this is a powerful way of knowing the world. You know, a way of knowing the world that respects evidence and that is careful in what it says and corroborates the claims that it makes. I would say that's also important in today's world, which has been described by some as a kind of post-truth era. Yeah, our young people are exposed to many different interpretations of the world, many different political, moral, social agendas. How are they to find their way through this? How are they to navigate those different truth claims if we don't give them some resources, some approaches that can be helpful to them? So I think the language which you're all using in how you describe this shoe is so important, it's worth highlighting to our students that there are things we know with certainty. It's a shoe and we're pretty confident about it's a child's shoe. We think maybe 2 or 3 years old. I think probably a little boy, right? So that's what I'll speak about. But I don't know that for certain. For the purpose of carrying on with this, and not having any other evidence to the contrary, now I'm asking you to go with me with the idea that this is maybe a 3-year-old boy who, well, what else can we say about this child? Is this the image of a shoe? I'm going to give you a hypothesis now to test, right, against the evidence. And I would do this if you were 14 or 15 years old. So I knew that I had to come and speak to you today. Danny had kindly invited me. I have to admit now I wasn't quite ready or prepared, so I needed something to show you. Luckily, this little boy was running past outside, and I tripped him up, took off his little shoe so I could photograph it with my iPhone, and load it up into this presentation so we'd have something to talk about. Okay, there's a hypothesis. There's a story about this shoe. So test it. Is it believable? Is it plausible? How do we test those truth claims?
We can
You're
check.
14, 15 years old. What would you think about that?
I would look at the degradation that's occurred. Well, and kids do. I mean, obviously this is not new. And so they could make or they could reasonably assume that this, I mean, if you look at my shoes from 1970, and you look at my old shoe about the same size, there's discoloration, there's some degradation that's occurred. So obviously this would be older than that. And so maybe they know grandma's shoe or mommy's shoe.
Yeah, and we didn't speak about that yet, right? We didn't say that this is an old shoe, really. We said, I think someone had said, it's maybe from a child who used it a lot, who was active, right? So we could see the use of the shoe in that way, but no one yet said this is an old shoe. And you're saying, it could be from the 1970s or so, right? It could be from, but it's decades ago we're talking about. Further back, yeah. Well, and there are things.
I think it's a very well worn shoe that could be passed down from child to child. And the shoelaces, you can see, are very worn. They're not new.
Thank you. So this is great. Again, you're not only making an inference, but you're backing it up with an explanation, a statement, right? I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why the story I just told about this shoe clearly doesn't make sense, right? One of them being from the evidence that you see in front of you itself, that the shoe isn't something which is worn by a child who's running around outside just now. It's an older shoe. I mean, there's also things that you can say, we don't know each other very well, right? But I would hope you might say, you don't seem the kind of person who would do that to a 3-year-old child, right? You can use what you can gauge about the person. Well, does it seem plausible? Does it seem believable? Or you could say that even if you had done that, you clearly wouldn't tell us because that's a terrible thing to do, right? There are things in the world, things from our knowledge and our experience that we can apply to truth claims, and there are things from the evidence itself, and we can use all of that. But let's stick with this idea that it's old. How do we know that? You've said, for instance, that it looks, the state of it, the discoloration of it. Someone else said, well, the laces. Think about the style of the shoe. Is this the sort of style of a shoe that a 3-year-old would be wearing today?
It was made a special way with a technology that allowed the leather to be shaped into a shoe form without stitching. And so this tells me that it was expensive and belonged to a child in a well-to-do family.
Okay, thank you. This issue of age, the style of it, I would say it doesn't look like a young person's shoe today, right? It doesn't have, it's not colorful. I mean, that could be partly because it's faded, but actually we can see, the bright colors that you would have on a 3-year-old's shoe today. It doesn't have any logos on it. It doesn't have a little flashing light on the back of it when you're walking along, like a kid's shoe, small kid's shoe might do today. If we turned it over, you wouldn't find one of these little wheels where kids can kind of slide along the floor on it, right? There are a number of things about the design and the style. Actually, it looks like a kind of miniature adult's shoe. Yeah, it's functional, but there's nothing childlike about it. And you mentioned the laces before. Would we expect to find laces on a 3-year-old's shoe today? We might do, but would we expect it? What's more likely to be on the fastening?
Paul, somebody did make a comment in the chat a few seconds ago that there's no Velcro.
Perfect, thank you. Great, and I can't see the chat, so thank you for that. Absolutely, you'd normally expect Velcro, right? And now, today, we have Velcro on young children's shoes most often, and we like to tell ourselves it's because we like to empower our children, right? They can do their shoes up themselves. This little boy would be too young to tie his own shoelaces. We can imagine, an older brother or a sister or a grandparent or a parent tying these laces up, and then he runs outside and plays the same kind of games that you played when you were 3 or 4 years old, but he's living maybe 70, 80 years ago. But Velcro, it's also something which is convenient for us. It means we don't have to spend that time, right? We can say it's about the kids' sense of empowerment, and it might be, but it's also quick, easy, cheap material, mass-produced shoes. So there's a lot we can kind of glean from the way the shoe is made. Let's have a closer look at that. If we do turn it over, as I said to you, there's no little wheel there for the kids to slide along and play like that. But what can you tell me about the sole of this shoe, and maybe how it's fitted to the upper that might be different from the shoes that we generally wear today?
I think it looks like it has been resoled.
Okay.
That is the little white dots, which are little pegs to hold the replacement sole onto the shoe.
Yeah, it might even, yeah, we can take a closer look, right? We can see that the sole actually is fixed with these little nails, these pins, these tacks. A part of the heel has come away, actually. You can see that the tacks are standing quite proud. Notice that they're square-headed rather than round. That's also a sign of the time in which they were made. What clue does this give us about the way in which this shoe might have been made? And we can see again, if we look closer at the sole, sorry, just have a look at the sole itself. What's that sole made from?
Leather.
Yeah, strips of leather. Yeah. If you had a look at your shoes today, you might have leather soles. They're probably not cobbled together with these little nails and tacks. Most of our shoes, what kind of sole do we have and how are they fixed?
Most shoes are glued.
They're rubber.
It's glue.
Yeah, molded soles,
Yeah.
rubber soles that are glued on, that are stuck on, and they might even appear to have some stitching around the top, you know, where it joins. But even when it has that, usually that's just a kind of cosmetic fashion aspect to it, right? It doesn't actually do very much. And we know that because this is one of the first things which falls apart with our shoes, isn't it? That the sole starts to peel off. Look how well made this shoe is. The fact that it's these different pieces of leather that have been cobbled together in this way. What indication? What does this mean about the way in which this shoe perhaps was made?
These are handmade.
They're handmade shoes. Yeah. We can imagine this child, a child, being taken to a local shoemaker, and that shoemaker tracing around the outline of the child's foot, and then cutting out the pieces, making a template, and then cutting out the pieces of leather to fit that child's foot, to using one of these wooden lasts, turning it over, sewing this together with one of these Singer sewing machines and putting it onto a wooden last and hammering in the little tacks or nails to hold it together. The whole thing made by hand from start to finish by a skilled craftsperson. And so it lasts, it holds well together. Our shoes, of course, they're mass produced. It has advantages that they are much cheaper, but they kind of fall apart quite quickly. They don't last very long. And when they do fall apart, most of us tend not to go and get them repaired. Most of us, most of the time, will throw them away. Not because we haven't got people who can fix them quite cheaply. You know, here at least, not far from where I live, you know, anywhere I can get my keys cut, I could get my soles fixed, for instance. There are shoe repairers. It doesn't cost very much. But the shoes are so cheap, we often don't bother, and we live in a throwaway, consumable, disposable society, right? Where we like buying new stuff. We buy stuff, we use it up, we throw it away, we buy new things. Fashions change, we like buying stuff. Does this little boy live in the same throwaway, disposable society, do we think? Is there any evidence on the shoe itself to say whether he does or not?
The shoe could have been handed down from person to person in the family. More than likely, he was not the first person who owned the shoe.
Possibly. What is it about the shoe that tells us that?
There are green stitches in the back that looks like they were trying to fix something.
Yeah, very good. It's been repaired, right? Now, a 3-year-old child cannot, however active that child is. I have 4 children myself, and they are pretty destructive, but none of them could cause this much devastation to a shoe at the age of 3 or 4 years old before their little foot outgrows the shoe. So your point that someone said probably it's been handed down, I think is almost certainly right. The child that had the shoe made for them isn't the child that had this repair, whose shoe was falling apart and needed it stitching up. Yeah, it's a different child. So those of you that said they thought it was from quite a rich family, and those who said they thought maybe it was from a poorer family, you're both right, maybe. You know, the person that first had the shoe made by the local shoemaker, potentially, well, clearly they had enough money to have this handmade shoe done. On the other hand, the person whose child is wearing it at the time it's falling apart, maybe it's been bought secondhand, maybe it's been handed down several times. Maybe this is a large family, but each child has had to wear it. So they could afford a shoe, but they can't afford replacement shoes. Okay, who did this repair? Is this being done by the same skilled craftsperson that made the original shoe? Who made the repair?
It actually looks like green wool.
The parent probably fixed it.
Yeah, I think we can be pretty confident. We don't know for sure who made it, but we do know for sure who didn't make this repair. Yeah, this is not a skilled craftsperson who's made that repair. If you took this shoe to a cobbler, you would expect and you'd pay for a kind of invisible mend. Because you don't want to, you might not have enough money to buy a new pair of shoes, but you don't want your kid in a shoe which is obviously falling apart. You'd want to make sure that that was, you know, not so obvious, a kind of invisible mend. And the skilled craftsman you took it to, who had the correct tools, etc., to do it, would clearly do a more professional job than this. This is a home repair, and as someone just said, perhaps a parent who did this. Yeah. And we can see that actually they haven't even used the right color thread. Maybe they've scavenged a piece of cotton or thread from another piece of clothing, what they had available. They haven't even gone to a market stall and bought the right kind of thread so that it was less obvious. They've made do with what they have. And we can see the stitching itself is rather rough. It's not, as I say, professionally done. So what does that tell us about how much care and attention the person put into this? Do you feel that this repair has been done rather hurriedly, without much thought or care, or do you think this person has spent a lot of time and a lot of effort over it?
I think there was care in that someone bothered to try.
Good.
So
Absolutely.
Maybe that mother wanted to at least have the pretense of having a child in a shoe that was in fairly good condition, or to make it easier to walk, or whatever the rationale was.
Great. And any other thoughts? Thank you. I think that's a great remark. Anything else? Anyone have a different opinion?
When I look at this, I see a sign of desperation. You know, if this was me today and that happened to one of my kids, I'd throw the shoe out and buy another one. But
Yeah.
obviously resources were scarce and they're trying to save something because they didn't have a replacement.
Good. Anyone else have a comment to make?
It actually looks like it was repaired once before. If you look at the base thread on top of the green.
Yeah, possibly. Maybe towards the base, maybe if it has been, then maybe it's been done more professionally in the past and now it's more of a home repair. I mean, I'll be honest with you, when I first started showing this shoe to groups, to students and to teachers, my first thought was, well, they haven't really spent a lot of time on it. They've stitched it up. It's functional, right? It does a job, but they haven't taken a lot of care on it because it's pretty rough and ready. And then I spoke to quite a few groups about that, and people agreed with that interpretation. And then I remember one person saying, actually, it's pretty hard to stitch leather, which I hadn't thought through. And she was saying, that's quite a difficult job to push that, by hand, pushing a needle through this leather, going round again. And I looked at it afresh. I looked at it another time, and now I look at it and I start to see there's more stitches there than you really need in order to do it functionally. What looks like a kind of rough and ready repair and quite a quick job, when you start to think about how difficult this is, how many stitches are in there, and some of them have come apart at the top, but they've put more stitches in than they need, and it's difficult, it starts to feel like actually someone put a lot of care and a lot of thought and a lot of effort into it. So
well,
why?
I'm sorry if I just may intervene. I come from a furrier's family, and in order to stitch leather, you have to have a special needle, which is a triangular needle. No needle will go through 2 layers of leather and stitch it together. You will break every needle. So it must have been somewhat professionally done with no means, at least for the thread.
Great, bringing in the knowledge of the group, and it adds to our understanding and it deepens the richness of what we're speaking about. Thank you for that. Why do you think someone would take so much time and care and attention over this? We're speculating now, right? So we're, again, going back to truth claims. These are not truth claims. These are now inferences, it's interpretation, it's possibilities, but possibilities that at least the evidence will bear, right? So again, for our students, they need to see where we're making a truth claim and where we're making a deduction or an inference or an interpretation. So I'm inviting you, why interpret this? Why do you think someone would have taken the time and effort over this that they have done?
Children usually outgrow their shoes within 6 months to a year.
Yeah.
So it looks like either the child outgrew the shoe and they forced the shoe on his foot, and in the process it broke, or it was handed down to another child, but the shoe did not fit, and that's how it got torn. And they tried to restore it to some use. The interesting thing is that the base of the heel is unaltered. It seems to be functional, but the top is destroyed.
Okay, thank you. We said that it might be that the heel was a later repair, right? That these things happen at different points. But I agree with you. I think this has been certainly it's been handed down through a number of children, I would say. But why the effort? Why more stitches than are necessary? That's the kind of thing which interests me, why this intrigues me. Because I think there are more stitches than you need to actually hold it together. Why do that?
Even when all else is gone, you have pride and you have love. So you love your child and you are still that sense of pride.
Hey, I think that's not a small thing to say, right? I mean, that's an important point. I've worked with a lot of groups, countless groups over this, and usually someone will say, someone will often say, well, it's because you don't want to have to do it again, right? Or you want, you put all this effort in because it's the kid still has to wear it, and it's a kind of functional, a very practical point, which is a perfectly reasonable interpretation. Could be the case. I intend more to the comment of our previous colleague, actually, this point about care for the child, because luckily I've never been in a situation where I've been in a position where I've had my child's shoes falling apart like this. And if they were falling apart, I could get them repaired locally. But if it fell on my resources, firstly, I would not be very good at this. I'm not very practical. I wouldn't do a good job, but I know I would try as hard as I could because I love my kid. I could imagine the effort I would put into this because I care about that child. And my point here is that although we have a child who lived 70, 80 years ago, and we can build up this picture, and you've done this just from your inferences and your discussion on the object itself, we can imagine that child, perhaps a little boy of about 3 years old, running around and playing, someone doing his laces up for him, the time in which he lived in a family that wasn't so wealthy, that was, couldn't afford new shoes, but someone cares about him, someone loves him enough that they're going to bother to do this repair and to probably put more stitches in it than really are needed. That's not a small thing to say about that child's situation, because we know that back then, and unfortunately still today, there are too many children in the world where no one really cares about them. Yeah, no one's really looking after them, where they are neglected. And we can see here that there is at least a child, a little boy, who was looked after. And we can build up a picture of him and his time, and even something of his family circumstances. There's a lot we can say then, right? Just from looking at one object. But of course, we run out of things to say. Again, if we are framed by the historical method, we can't invent. And so I can't give this child a name. I can't tell you where he lived, what language he spoke, what his parents did for a living. If we were writing in a literature class, you could give this as a task, right? And they could use their literary imagination to conjure up a full story or picture. In history, we can't do that. We can only say what the evidence will bear, the truth claims and the interpretation and deduction, that will only go so far. So we end up coming to a kind of full stop with this object. But I'm going to put it over to you again as sort of 14 or 15-year-olds. Is there any question that you could imagine a group of young people asking that might help us with more understanding of this object and why we're looking at it? What questions might come to mind at this point? Anything that might, what more would you like to know?
Where was the shoe found and by whom?
Brilliant question. And every group I've ever worked with, someone will come with that question. It's the one question which unlocks everything else. So as I say, I don't know who he was, I have no photograph, I don't know his name, but we do know where it was found. And it was found at a place called Auschwitz-Birkenau. So for your students, this is the first time we've introduced some actual factual historical knowledge of the time and some context of this shoe. And for some of them, I'm saying this would be an opening for them in a new series of lessons on the Holocaust. So some might never have heard of Auschwitz, but it's a commonly known enough name that there will be some students who know something about it. So what might they tell us about Auschwitz if we throw it open to them? What might our typical group that hasn't studied this in any depth already know something about this place name? What would they say?
What happened to the child?
Okay, but and we'll come to that, but what could they tell us about the place Auschwitz? What does that mean to a 15-year-old today who hasn't studied the Holocaust but might have heard something about it?
My students know that it was a concentration camp.
Okay, very good. Thank you. It's a concentration camp run by who?
And they've already heard about the Nazis.
Okay, so they know the Nazis. Yeah, good.
By this level, by 15.
And where might they think Auschwitz was?
Most of them, without prior knowledge, would say Germany, just because that would be the first assumption. They would not think Poland.
Right. So, so we have knowledge in the room that our students bring with them to the classroom, and this will be a big part of what we talk about. Those of you that join us in our second session, challenges in Holocaust education, knowing what is in the room before we start teaching and the assumptions that young people make and the knowledge they have and the misconceptions. So we invite them to tell us something about Auschwitz before we give them some information. So we know what we're dealing with. And we would need at this point to begin narrating. Okay, so I know you know this history, but again, just so you see how I would work with this object with a group of students, at this point, I'd start telling them something about the history of the camp and what this place was. I would be telling them that Auschwitz was as you say, a camp, Nazi camp in German-occupied Poland during the Second World War. And actually it was a vast camp, not one single site, but a place with 3 major sites, Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, and Auschwitz III, and up to 50 different sub-camps over a vast area of some 16 square miles. And the Auschwitz I would be was a concentration camp where people were from many different nationalities and different groups were held in this camp, forced to do hard manual work in appalling conditions, brutally treated and murdered in that place. Auschwitz III, Bunamonowitz, a slave labor camp based on a huge industrial complex owned by the world's 2nd largest corporation at that time, IG Farben. Thousands of slave laborers, again, being worked to death in that slave labor process in appalling, brutal conditions. And then Auschwitz II, which also had a function as a slave labor camp, but had another function as well, which was that of a death camp. Now, although Auschwitz was the largest of all the Nazi camps in all of German-dominated Europe, thousands of camps, concentration camps, transit camps, sub-camps, work camps, labor camps, prisoner of war camps. There were only really 6 true death camps, and Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest of them. What makes it a death camp is that the purpose of this function was to murder people on arrival as quickly as possible. And it was Auschwitz II where this little shoe was found, the site of that death camp. Now, what can we say most likely about the background or heritage of this little boy? Knowing that this was found at Auschwitz II, the site of a murder camp, a death camp, what else might we now imagine about his background?
Jewish boy.
He was a German Jewish boy.
Well, certainly, almost certainly he was Jewish. Possibly he was German, could have been. The people were taken from all over German-dominated Europe to Auschwitz. He could have been a Polish Jewish boy, a German Jewish boy, French, Norwegian, Greek. I would say most likely, and we don't know this for sure, but most likely he was a Hungarian Jewish boy, because it was found at the end of the war, and the last major transports to Auschwitz were Hungarian Jews, and so many of them actually that about 1/3 of all the people that were murdered in Auschwitz were Hungarian Jews. So if we were going to guess nationality, I think that's most likely, but we don't know. Most likely he was Jewish. It's possible he was a Roma or Sinti child, so-called gypsy child. Roma and Sinti also suffered immense persecution and genocide at the hands of the Nazis and their collaborators. And some 23,000 Roma and Sinti family members were sent to Auschwitz, of whom about 21,000 of them perished there. Most of them through the appalling conditions and disease, about 18,000 or so. About 3,000 of them were murdered in the gas chambers in August of 1944. And a few of them, a couple of thousand, survived the camp. So it's possible that he was a Sinti child, but clearly he's not a political opponent of the Nazis, right? He's a little boy. Clearly he's not a gay man. There are other victims of Nazi persecution also sent to the concentration camps, also murdered, also sent to Auschwitz. But because of the size of the shoe, the fact that we know this is a young child, almost certainly he was Jewish, because 90% of all the people who were murdered in Auschwitz were Jews. So of 1.3 million people sent to Auschwitz, 1.1 million of them were Jewish. About 1 million of those Jewish people were murdered in Auschwitz, about 1 in 6 of all the people in the Holocaust. So we can assume quite strongly that this is a child, a Jewish child, who would have traveled to Auschwitz. How? What was most likely his mode of transport there? What are we imagining now? What are we seeing?
Train,
A train? What kind of a train? What kind of train car?
cow,
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you.
with a cargo, like a train that would, for transporting cattle,
Yeah,
a
like a
cattle car.
cattle wagon or a freight wagon. These wooden boarded box cars. Again, not everyone went in this way, but such vast numbers did. It's quite likely that he might be in one of those train transports, in one of those freight wagons or cattle wagons. It could be 100 or so people crammed into each of those wagons, traveling for several days and nights. Very little food, 1 bucket of water to drink from, to be shared amongst all these people, another bucket for their toilet needs. The filth in that place, the lack of air, in summer the heat, in winter the freezing conditions. Many people died on the way on these trains. They expired through cold or through heat, or they had heart attacks, particularly the elderly and the sick. People were crushed. But the train in those awful conditions, and this little boy traveling on something like this, would have arrived at Auschwitz and ground to a halt, and the doors would have been unlocked, slid open. Maybe 2,000 or so people spilled out onto the ramp in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and very quickly that group of people separated into 2 large groups, men and older boys on one side, women and young children on the other side. Each group forming 5 straight lines so that they could be counted quickly by the SS guards. 5, 10, 15, 20, they can make sure the number plus those, the dead on the train, tally with the number on the transport. They moved those lines towards a Nazi doctor, an SS medical doctor, standing in uniform on the ramp, who looks at each person in turn and very quickly, in a matter of seconds, decides whether they go to the left or the right. A small number of them, depending on how many people they needed to work in the camp at that time, a small percentage would be sent for hard manual work in the camp. 85, 90% or more of them were sent the other side. A child of 2 or 3 years old clearly is not needed to work inside the concentration camp, is not capable of working inside the camp. A child of this age would almost certainly have gone the other way. There were some children that were taken for medical experiments, a very tiny percentage, particularly if they were twins. But most likely, almost all of the children of this age would be sent the other side. And they would, wearing this shoe, this little boy walked down the train line, perhaps a kilometer or so, short distance down this train line, towards a large building, a large brick building. And this child might have been holding the hand of his grandparent, or perhaps carried in his mother's arms. It's possible also he walked alone, because children even as young as 2 or 3 years old sometimes arrived in Auschwitz with no family. They'd already been separated from their family before. We can't know for sure, but we can imagine this child walking towards this building and reaching the top of some steps that go down underground, and with the other people from his town and community, this little boy walking down into a large undressing area with wooden benches and hooks on the wall. And they were told, undress, you're going to need to get washed before you go into the rest of the camp. Take off your clothes, so you're going to go for a shower. So take off your clothes and hang your clothes on a clothes peg, and remember the number on that clothes peg so that you can find your clothes quickly when you come back from your shower. Tie your laces together on your shoes so that you can find them quickly when you come back. When you retrieve your shoes, it won't take too long and they won't have all got mixed up. And then this little boy, naked by this time, with members of his family, his friends, his community perhaps, will push through into the next room, which looked like a shower room, with shower nozzles hanging from the ceiling and water pipes across the walls and the ceiling of this room. And the door was shut and locked and sealed behind them. And as you know, of course, and as some of your students would already know from their own knowledge, this is all fake, this is all deception. There is no plumbing that goes to those water pipes. There is no water that can come out of those shower heads. Instead, from holes in the ceiling, buckets containing tins, canisters of Cyclone B pellets were lowered down through gas columns protected by wire mesh to stop people getting at these canisters. As the Cyclone B pellets reacted with the air, hydrogen cyanide gas was given off, and all the people in this room were murdered within the next 20 minutes or so. After that time, the room would be ventilated, the doors opened, and prisoner inmates were forced to go inside and drag out the bodies of the dead, including the body of this little boy. And those corpses were pushed into large crematorium ovens, furnaces, and this young boy's body was turned to ash. Mingled with the ashes of the other dead from his community, these ashes would have been dumped into a nearby pond or thrown into the river Vistula nearby, or the river Sola, or sometimes scattered on the nearby fields to be used as fertilizer to help the crops grow on the nearby farms. Or in wintertime, the ashes were sometimes used to grip the roads to stop the tires from sliding and skidding on the ice. And that's what happened to this little boy, this child in Auschwitz. And the only thing we have that remains of him to this day, the only thing that shows he ever lived, that once in this world there was a boy of 2 or 3 years old, is this one little shoe. Are there any thoughts or comments anyone would like to make or share before we move on? This can be a very difficult story for young people to encounter, and it's a difficult story to tell and to retell. It's important, if we're going to expose young people to this difficult history, this emotionally challenging past, that we also give them space and time to process and to reflect and to think through the implications of what they've been hearing. So in terms of timing, I've been keeping an eye on our time because we have another 30 minutes or so together to think through these issues. What's really important is if you're working with a group of students in the classroom, that the lesson bell doesn't go at this point and they have to go out to their maths lesson or they go to their science studies or something. They need time to be able to think this through, and they also need a structure and a scaffolding to enable them to do it. One obvious way is to say, so how do you feel about that? Which I think is a really bad way of proceeding, right? Because why should a group of 14, 15, 16-year-olds open up and tell us how they feel, especially amongst their peers, where they are maybe not sure how to deal with these emotions, where they don't know how other people will react to them. We need to be more careful and more thoughtful in how we explore this past and its implications. So I'm going to offer you a structure with which you might come up with something better. But this is a structure which I've used with many young people, and it's worked well for me and with those groups. What I say to students, I don't ask them how they feel at this point. Like with you, I invited, if anyone had a comment, you could share it. But it's a lot to take on. Rather, I would like to take us out of the emotional affective space that we were just in and move towards a cognitive domain, which can give us a way of thinking through what we've just encountered together. So I'm going to ask us to go back over what we've done so far today. And I want to suggest that there are 3 major elements to how we can work with this object. The first of them we've already done, where I introduced the object to you without any historical context and just asked, what can we say about it? Right? What can we reasonably infer? Look at it closely and what can you deduce? And we built up a strong picture together, collectively, as a social group, sharing different thoughts and ideas, building off one of each other, discussing and debating it. And we built up, I think, quite a vivid picture of who this child might have been. When we got as far as we could with that, I layered in, and this would be your role as the educator, the kinds of contextual narratives we can't expect our young people to have at this stage. So we draw on evidence of what we know about Auschwitz from many other sources, from archaeological investigations, from visiting the site, from photographs of the time, from documents of the time, from eyewitness testimonies, survivors and perpetrators who have spoken about that place. And we're able to place that child in that time and relate the most likely narrative of what would have taken place there and what would have happened to that little boy. And that's where we've got to so far. What I'd like to move to is, what does this mean? How does this, what questions does this raise for us? What questions would this raise for our 14, 15 or 16-year-old students who might be quite new to this subject? What kinds of issues, themes, questions, unanswered ideas might we have that have been stimulated by what we've come to so far? And I'm going to ask you in a moment to move into small breakout rooms of maybe just 4 people or so in each group. And Ari very kindly is going to take care of the technical side of this. But what I want you to think about before you go into those groups is, what questions would you expect a 14, 15-year-old to have at this point? What questions, issues, or themes what would they want to discuss right now? What would they want to know or discuss? And I'm going to ask you to go into small groups and come up with as many questions as you can based on what you think a 15-year-old might want to know or discuss at this point, and then come back to plenary and share some of your thinking. So we'll just spend about 3 minutes or so together in those smaller rooms. Gives you a break from my voice, a chance for you to talk to each other, and then Ari will bring you back into this space and I'll ask you to share what you think, what you've been discussing. Is everyone happy with that? Before you jump into those rooms, is that clear? Are there any questions? Do you know what you'll be doing? I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay. So Ari, please, if you'd move people into those rooms just for 3 minutes or so, have a chance in that space to share, what do you think would be the most urgent, important, interesting questions or issues that young people would like to discuss at this point?
Okay, I'm opening the rooms.
Lovely, thank you.
And if you weren't moved automatically, you might need to just click something that says move to your breakout room, or if you see the little menu, you can click join. Well, no one's alone in a breakout room, so that's good. If anyone needs help getting into their rooms, unmute and let me know and I'll talk you through it.
Thank you for that, Ari. Appreciate it. Ari, should we bring people back?
Yes, the rooms will close in 10 seconds and then they'll have 30 seconds to join us again.
Okay, thank you so much.
I that was too short, Paul. That was
okay.
I'm sorry.
And we had just gotten started as well, but even so, that was a good experience. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, thank you. I apologize that you didn't have long enough, and of course, students would be given quite a bit longer. But maybe we could invite one person from each group just to begin sharing some of the conversation that you had there, and we can open it up now in this plenary instead. Who would like to begin?
May I ask that Tom Albano, can you make your comment to everyone that you made in our breakout?
Sure. Basically, what I said, what I really liked about the presentation was how it became a very individual human being presentation. Instead of, 6 million Jews, instead of 1.5 million children, it made it on a very personal level. And I really appreciate that way of teaching the Holocaust so that the students can definitely relate better, to this is a child, could be my brother, you know what I mean?
I found it interesting how you started with a picture that showed a shoe that looked like a shoe that a child could still wear today, and by showing different aspects of it, the sole, the back, the story evolved and became very sad, heartbreaking. Thank you. Thank you for teaching us.
Thank you both.
I wonder if teenagers ask the question of how the world could allow this to happen.
Right. Excellent. Yes, absolutely. They could ask that for sure. And I'll share with you in a moment some of the kinds of questions that we might expect or anticipate from students. But So thank you for that one. Did any of you in your groups manage to, I should have given you more time. Did some of you get to that question of what might students ask or want to know more about at this point? Such as, how could the world have allowed this to happen? Did anyone have any other types of questions like that?
The other question they do ask sometimes is why the Jews went to Auschwitz like sheep, didn't fight back. And that's a subject that is rarely discussed because there were lots and lots of people who fought and died fighting instead of being killed at the concentration camp.
Thank you. Did anyone else have, in your groups, did you have some other, do you want to share something from the discussion, or in particular, did you have any of these questions you'd hope young people might ask?
I had begun to share in my group. I recently taught the World War II and the Holocaust in my 9th grade world history class. And the question that the students have overwhelmingly is the why. Why did it happen? Why did Europe do something? Why didn't the United States do something? How many events led up to the Holocaust where the international players could have gotten involved and no one either chose to intervene or didn't think it was going to get to that point?
Thank you. Great questions. Very good. Great that they come from your students. Anyone else have again, want to share something from your discussions, or again, questions that you might
One
pose?
of the questions I've been asked at schools, whether the experience as a child survivor strengthened my faith. And this is a difficult one to answer, especially for me, because I really don't have any faith. Not in Hashem. That's a very difficult question to answer, but it's particularly in Christian schools, they ask that question. And they expect something that would be, God's will, and I understand that we were punished and all that nonsense.
So some might ask the kind of question, why was this allowed to happen? How did the world allow it? Why didn't the Allies do more? Why didn't people in Europe? So those were very sort of human and very historical questions. Or some might actually ask, well, where was God when this was taking place, right? What does this mean for people's faith or people's belief? And whatever question comes from the students is a good question because it's an authentic question, right? It's something that they genuinely and sincerely are interested in. And that's really what we're trying to collect at this point, and also at this stage in their learning, right at the very beginning, giving them an opportunity to encounter something about this past, and then really hand it over to them to raise the questions that they're interested in. Any other groups want to feedback?
Yes, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just with my little group, Nina, and where is she? Where is she? Don't remember her name, so sorry now. I don't think she's here anymore. The why question, I teach the Holocaust in my foreign language class questions regularly. And the first question, like some of my colleagues here said, is the why, but there's also the how. I mean, the why is one thing, but how did it happen within 12 years to wipe out, what are the different steps? And then, of course, you can somehow maybe draw some conclusions about steps that happen elsewhere and similar steps. And where are we on that? If we look back at the pyramid of hate, where are we now already?
Thank you.
I had a couple years ago, one student, process this and learning about the camps and ask, well, wait a second, the Germans were fighting a war. Yes. And they're putting all this effort into murdering all these Jews. Yes. But there was hundreds of thousands, millions of adults, and they're fighting a war. and all this manpower that could help them, and they're getting rid of, and exerting manpower to get rid of them. Why, you know, that connection of the pure insanity and that it was so illogical to, from a war standpoint, like, why are they getting rid of all this manpower, this asset that they could have used? You know, and it was a totally different kind of way of looking at it, but it was incomprehensible what they were doing.
Right, thank you. Yeah, there's a natural, understandable degree of confusion, right, around many of these questions and these issues, which we'll come back to actually in a moment. Thank you for that.
There's also a deeper meaning, Paul, in what Danny said, which is, what is the response, and our students can grapple with this, what is the responsibility of the citizenry when there are such atrocities? And that's a question that our students can really sink themselves into, in terms of responsibilities towards other people.
Absolutely, absolutely, they can, sure. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, then I'll share with you, if you like, some of the questions that over the years tend to be asked by groups. So the kinds of questions or issues that young people might naturally ask, having had this encounter, this first encounter with the Holocaust through this object. Who would do this? A 3-year-old child, and why? Which was the question that some of you were asking as well, suggesting students might come up with. I mean, that's a really important historical question, isn't it? Why did this happen? Why would someone do this? How is it possible in the modern world? I think that echoes one of the points that was also made before. Well, did people know what was happening? And that speaks to that issue about responsibility, doesn't it? Did people know? How is this possible? If they knew, why didn't anyone save him? What was going on there? Why, that can change to, why didn't his parents protect him? Why didn't they look after him better? Why the Jews? You know, we've focused very much that this is a young Jewish boy. It's natural for young people to want to know why. And also, why didn't, this was also mentioned, right? This notion of, why did people go? Why didn't they fight back? Why didn't they resist? Again, it's a very natural question for young people to ask. Some of you were saying about, you know, if we know more about how, maybe we can also see warning signs in the present today about other places, other areas where violence is increasing, where these things might be threatened. Surely this, a deeper layer of meaning, one of the things that we get, I think, from this shoe, a child, is the innocence of the victims, which also links to the why was this happening to them. But the innocence of that one child, of course, speaks for the innocence of millions. No one mentioned this here, but it's an interesting point, I think, a question of, why have you still got the shoe? Yeah, why is that kept? And I think one of the things there we could speak to would be that all the things that people brought with them to Auschwitz, whether that was their clothing, their pots and pans, their umbrellas, their shoe brushes, their razors, their shaving razors, you know, people didn't know what they were going to and what was happening to them. So, you know, why did people go? Well, because the deception was a major part of this, of course. People brought cheese graters to a death camp. People brought pots and pans, you know, the things of life. And all those things were kept, their spectacles, their combs, their hairbrushes. Everything was kept because everything in Auschwitz was seen to have some value. A great deal of money was made out of this place. The gold teeth from their mouths, right? Everything had this value, except, of course, for one thing, which was human life. So they end up keeping this shoe, despite how battered it is and how it's falling apart, because they value the shoe more than they value that little boy. And what does that mean for us today? What might that child, had he lived, done with his life? What would he have become? Who would have loved him, and who would he have loved? What work would he have done? What contribution would he have made? And now if we multiply that up by 1.5 million Jewish children who were murdered during the Holocaust, that's 90% of all Jewish children in German-occupied Europe were murdered, 90%. How much has the world lost? How much has Europe lost from the destruction, the genocide that destroyed so many of these communities? You know, these are deep questions, right? And deep layers of meaning. Many of the questions, the really good historical questions, why did it happen? Why the Jews? Why didn't more people fight back? I would say that in this lesson, in this activity, the purpose would not be to try and answer those questions. The purpose of this activity is to have young people themselves raise these questions, because they are then authentic questions that they want the answers to. And I think that gives us a powerful position as educators with our students, where they come back to the next question, the next lesson, wanting to know more. And we can plan our next 6 lessons or our 10 lessons, however much curriculum time we have. We can plan to allow them to investigate these questions, and they care enough about them and want to know the answers, which is why the reason why I would suggest we should never answer these questions. Young people and adults ask these questions and they want to know the answers, mainly so that they can stop thinking about them, because these are difficult, disorienting questions. But we shouldn't resolve these questions for them. We should provide them with opportunities to go deeper into this past and to go deeper into the meanings that come out of them. And there's no need to ever end that period of questioning. Many of you will have been working in this field for many years. I have been also, and I don't have fully satisfactory answers for myself on many of these issues, but that means I keep reading, I keep thinking, I keep listening to other people's ideas. That's what we want, I think, for something of this magnitude and this enormity. We want our students not to stop thinking about it. I think that would be rather dangerous. So to summarize, here's a kind of philosophy of learning, if you like, that I wanted to share with you, and I've done it through this particular activity in this object, and I hope you found it valuable, and I've really enjoyed listening to your thinking, your ideas. I'd like us to think together just to reflect on what we're trying to do with students. One area is substantive knowledge, the things that happened in the past. Think for a moment about the new knowledge that 14, 15 or 16-year-olds would have been exposed to through this activity that we've just done. What is it that they didn't know before about that past, which hopefully they now know a little bit more? So there is historical, substantive, factual knowledge which we've communicated, I hope. But is that all it means to learn about the past? Is it just knowing more stuff? Is it just an accumulation of information? What I want to suggest is that there's more to learning than that. And one of the things that I hope we can get with our students is a change in the way that they think about things and the change in the way that they see things. If you look at this shoe again and think back to how we imagine our students would encounter that shoe when we first show it to them and ask, what is this object and who might have worn it? The way that you look at that object at that point, it's just an old shoe. By the time we've got through this activity together and we show them the same picture again, do they see it in the same way? Does the shoe just seem, why are we bothering with this little object? I think the value of that object will change with the knowledge which they have now of its context and of the owner of that little shoe. The shoe itself is the same shoe. The photograph is the same photograph. The thing which has changed is the student who looks at that object. The knowledge which they have been exposed to makes them see it in a different way. That's what my theory of learning would be. That we are changed by what we know. And I also hope that those aspects, when we look to the disciplinary knowledge, how do we know what we know about the past? How do we use evidence? How do we interpret it? How do we weigh truth claims? I hope that's useful for them as they go on to inquire into the past, but also as they go about their lives sifting the information that they get in the news, on the internet, from their friends, from their family, from their teachers. How do they test those truth claims? That hopefully is an empowering series of disciplinary knowledge for them. And finally, I'd like to end with just some reflection on some educational principles that underpin my work, and I hope that you see is evident in that last activity. And if we work together in the next 2 sessions, which I hope we will, I hope you'll join us for the future workshops. I hope you'll see these principles echoed again. The first one is I hope a deep respect for the victims and for our students. You know, that we talked, some of you were kind enough to mention the humanizing aspect, that we look at an individual, not just a mass of people. It's not 6 million victims, it's one person who is killed and another 6 million times. And we make the effort to rehumanize the people in the past. But I hope also a respect for the students, that we are interested in what they think and we give them ownership of their own learning. We ask them questions and we encourage them to think it through for themselves. It is an emotional, it is a difficult history, but we're not trying, and we are open to the fact that we are trying to move our students. We want them to be engaged, but that the horror of the Holocaust is not found in atrocious images bombarding them with heaps of naked bodies. There again, there would be no respect for the students or the victims in those sorts of images. The horror of the Holocaust can be found in something as apparently ordinary as a single shoe. I want to suggest that learning is authentic when we are interested in our students and their responses drive the discussion and they are brought into the conversation, and that they form their own questions. At the end of that, we're interested in the questions that they raise, that the meanings they make are their own meanings, that they're not manipulated into taking what we think is important from this. In that sense, the meanings are more powerful, I hope, because they're owned by them, they're not borrowed from us. This idea of rehumanizing the past, moving from the individual to the general, we've spoken about. And finally, I think this history needs no dramatization, no embellishment, a simple object, a simple shoe, and a discussion around that. We don't need theatricality, we don't need violin music, we don't need to dress this up. The power of the object, the power of the story, and the engagement with the individual people, I think is enough, and we don't need to embellish it in any way. So that's really, thank you so much again for your time. If you wanted a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, I wrote this initially, this approach, for the United Nations Holocaust Memorial Day back in 2009, and you can find it on their website at this address. There's also a lesson plan there, which will give you also teaching notes, historical notes, to help you with that guided conversation with the students, also suggested questions to ask at each point. There's also a short video that I made at the time where you can see the object itself, the actual shoe, and we discuss what we can learn from it. That might be useful to show for your students. Please also keep in touch with me. I hope I'll see you again the next time for this Meeting the Challenges of Holocaust Education. But as we're coming to an end now, I'd really be grateful if you're on Twitter, perhaps just go on and tag me on @P_Salmons. Let me know what you thought about this session. Let others know, good, bad, or indifferent, whatever your comments are. Let's continue a conversation on there if you think that would be important and useful. And again, just thank you to Danny and Ari for the technical side, and Danny for inviting me. I've really had a pleasure of meeting you all, even virtually today. Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. It was so interesting, and thank you everybody for joining us. And I hope you'll be able to join us for the next 2 sessions. Paul's doing 2 more sessions with us. One is on meeting the challenges of Holocaust education, which is next Friday, June 25th at 11 a.m. And then his last session with us is Sunday, June 27th at 4 p.m. on use of language and how we approach language when talking about the Holocaust. So I'll be sending out more information on these to you via email, along with the link that is being posted right now. And we hope to see you there. Please share all this information with your colleagues and fellow teachers, because this is some great approaches to teaching what we all know is a very difficult subject. So once again, Paul, thank you. Thank you everybody for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.